Circle at the end of the show. But other than that, there is absolutely no sampling. And people go, I don't believe that. I go, well, I don't care. I know the truth, and if you don't believe it, well, you don't go ahead and don't believe it. But like I said, there is that one song now, which is at the very end of the show.
It's an interesting thing. When I think of the Van Hagar years, for example, the sound that comes to mind is Sammy and Michael's voice blending together. It's not so much the big solos. That, to me, is the defining sound of that era, is Sammy and Michael blending together.
Well, they sure did make some great records.
Yeah, that's true. Do you think that Ed was a little jealous of how tight those two were?
I can't really say. I don't know. But as things wore on and Ed and Sam started to have their differences, it just seemed, I mean, from the get-go, when everything was great, it was always Ed and Al, sharing a dressing room, and
right.
Michael and whoever.
Right.
Michael and Gary, Mike and Sam.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know if there was if you could call it jealousy. I just think that it was actually more that things started to unravel between Sam and Ed.
So no, I thought that it seemed like Ed and Al might have gotten a little upset that Michael and Sam went on tour together for the Sam and Dave tour. Michael did about half the shows on that tour. Were you on that tour?
No, actually, I was the crew chief for Poison, and I was in the middle of a Poison tour. I did like 4 or 5 Poison tours. When they invited Michael to come out, at first they were hoping to have an encore with all 3 of them, and that was always scheduled to happen, but then it kind of fell apart, and Dave decided to not do it.
Right.
But no, I wasn't there. When Michael did do shows with those guys, it made a really big difference. They advertised ahead of time in the ticket sales, especially after the initial luster of the tour wore off,
Right.
So I know for the second half of the tour, Michael ended up getting his own contract from Live Nation.
Wow.
They were like, hey, man, this makes a big difference in ticket sales. So instead of Michael just being a guest, they contracted him and paid him separately,
Is that when the whole other half thing came about 4 years later?
Well, no, it's something that they just wanted to do. Like Sam said, we could do all this different stuff, including, let's recreate solos and, do a bit of the best of each year of your solos. So that was really fun. But no, Sam had that idea, and he approached Michael and said, let's do a tour and just call it the other half,
In terms of the Gary situation, did they do a full second album with Gary and hand it into Warner Brothers?
No, I don't believe that ever happened. Okay. Not to the best of my knowledge.
Okay. All right. Did you hear any of that material?
They were working on stuff because Edward was always writing way in advance. Edward was always constantly writing and stuff. And, what a talent. To mold his guitar playing around a commercial hook was such a gift that he had, I heard different things in the studio all the time. But after that tour, I think Gary came out once. I'm not sure. My memory's a bit foggy. But then it just kind of fell apart,
Right, of course.
So I was always hearing new material, but, it wasn't like they had started a record as far as I remember.
As a bass tech, what exactly do you do for Mike as a bass tech, and how has that role changed over the years?
Well, I started out just being a bass tech, and then we became friends. And, now, 40 years later, Michael is one of my closest friends on earth. We talk every day, and I moved up by him. After living on the beach for years, I moved up to Glendora, California, where he was. But about 10 years after that, his kids grew up, and him and his wife, they sold their house, and they moved down to the beach after getting me to move up there and bought their retirement home. So I don't see him physically as often as I did. Okay, so starting out, I was his bass tech, and then we became friends. I initially just instinctually started taking over, contacting all the people we dealt with and taking over that role a lot more than I think other techs that worked for him had. Then, he started asking me, hey, can you come around? I'm gonna be doing an interview, do this, do that, and it just expanded and expanded to the point where I was taking care of a lot of his business. And to this day, that's still what I do. Like if he's doing an interview, he'll say, can you help me set this up? And I'll call the guy and I'll say, look, you can use the warehouse. We have offices, or I could put up a bunch of cases. You can, do it in front of cases,
right,
or in front of his boss. Or
sure.
It's expanded quite a lot. I'm not his manager. I've never claimed to be, but I handle equipment business for him.
Does he have a manager?
Yeah, more or less. The guy that manages Sammy, Tom Consolo, manages Michael.
You have worked with a lot of bands over the years. You mentioned Poison, for example, and some other ones. So How is working with Van Halen unique as compared to working with any other band?
Well, like I said, I was with them for 29 years, so I knew them a lot better, and it was more family-oriented. And like I said, they handled things different. They were the only band that I ever worked for, at least up until when Sam came in and Sam's manager took over. But before that, Van Halen was the only band I'd ever seen whose manager worked for them instead of them working for their manager. You know, they told their manager what to do. Most times it's the other way around.
Right.
Managers have a lot of weight. They sign a band. They tell the band, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. Well, when I came into the band told the manager what to do, and the band did things a lot differently than other people did. Like way back when, in the early 80s, they owned their own T-shirt warehouse, and they had one of their trucks who constantly went from the road back to that factory, from the factory back to the road. And they would come out and dump a truckload of merchandise out and split it up among the other trucks and go back. They didn't work with a T-shirt company. They designed their own T-shirts and manufactured them, sold them, and cut out the middleman. That was brilliant. They made a ton of money by doing that, as opposed to most bands, go through Winterland, or they go through, through the years, there's been a lot of different big T-shirt companies that come and go. Okay, that was totally different. Like I said, the fact that they would rehearse their show a week prior to them going out, they would do the show in front of 1,000, 2,000 people. That I've never seen another band do. That was incredible. And when Dave was in the band, we all stayed together in the same hotels. When Sam came in, all that changed. Which is not, I'm not saying anything negative about Sam. That's not where I was going with that.
Right.
But it changed where the band stayed in different hotels and the crew stayed in different hotels. So
how would you describe Roth's relationship with Mike?
They're friends. They get along now better than they did back then. But back then, Dave was Dave, and Dave had a lot going on, always doing interviews and stuff. So they've always been friends.
I mean, do they still talk today?
I don't know necessarily they talk, but they communicate once in a while, and there's no bad blood there.
No, of course not. No.
We were going to try to go see Dave when he opened up in Vegas, and then something came up. They booked a gig for the Circle, and we couldn't do it. We were going to kind of surprise Dave. I was going to give Dave a call and say, I got Michael here, can we come back? And then Michael was going to, if Dave asked him to, he was even going to come out and do the encore. But Dave never knew that. We were going to, just show up and surprise him, because I knew some of the people on his crew, so I knew I could get a message to him. But like I said, a gig came up, and we ended up not being able to do it,
Well, we went to that Vegas show, and we enjoyed ourselves. We did a whole podcast from that, actually. That was a great time. In terms of the road from 81 all the way through to 84, what was the vibe like with the band on the road? The band escalated in popularity 4 times the amount. It was like crazy from 81 to 84. They just skyrocketed to such high degrees. What do you think it was about the band that just caused it to escalate even higher than it already was?
Well, one of the things, like I said before, was Edward had this incredible talent to be able to write commercial hooks around his great guitar playing. I shouldn't say great, I should say phenomenal guitar playing, that Roth was able to pick up on and make into commercial lyrics. And a lot of it had to do with Ted Templeman. I just read Ted Templeman's book, and it's one of the best rock and roll books that I have ever read. What an insight into how Ted became a producer. But, Ted, he had a gift, and he was able to capture that sound. And they just got tighter and got better at the writing. The popularity when we toured just kept going. Back then when we toured, we would tour behind a record for a year and a half, 2 years. And then the band would, they'd always take a couple months off. Edward would already have new material written. He would give demos to Al, and he really didn't have to with Al, because they would be in the studio together.
Right.
But they'd give Michael a demo, and Michael would work out his parts, and then they would make a rough demo of the 3 of them and give it to Roth, and Roth he'd have his road guy Larry Hausler drive him around in Panama, which is his red car, which the song was written about.
Right.
And Dave would imbibe in some pot and write great lyrics. They just escalated, and it was a well-oiled machine that just kept getting bigger and better.
Absolutely.
And the road vibe was incredible. We had anywhere between 80 and 100 people, depending on what tour, on crew. On days off, the production manager back then, Patrick Whitley, he would come up with ideas. They'd rent a lake. We'd descend on this lake and go water skiing and have parties. The band would give Patrick a bunch of money, and he'd go and stock the buses and with food and beer, and it was great. When I was growing up, I always heard what tours were like. When I went to work for Van Halen, that's the only time I ever saw it, be what you always heard about. Women, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you know?
Right.
So the myth was alive and well with Van Halen. Is that what you're saying?
The myth was reality. Everything you always heard about, it was there and then some. You know, let me explain something. On nights where we were playing 2 or 3 nights or 4 nights in arenas, whenever we didn't have to tear down, there was always a fund that was available. And Edward's guitar tech, the legendary Rudy Liren, he would get a tuxedo, and he'd hire a girl in a French maid's outfit, and they went 2 suites together, and we would have an incredible party, and Rudy would be the bartender. Everybody was always given 5 backstage passes, and you were never allowed to give them to a guy. So after the show, since we didn't have to tear down, there'd be a huge party in the hospitality room, and our security would go around and put a mark on all these passes. And if the chick got her pass mark, then she could come to the hotel to the party there.
Wow.
And the parties would last till 9 or 10 the next morning.
Oh, my God.
And that would happen every night that we didn't have to tear down. It was called Raving Rude's Libation Station, and it was a legendary thing.
That's awesome.
You know? I used to say if you couldn't get laid on a Van Halen tour on the nights we didn't have to tear down, then you were gay or you didn't want to. You know?
So now, in terms of the Sammy era, was that still the same, or was the vibe very different backstage?
No, it was totally different with Sammy. A lot of things changed. The new management were the ones that decreed that the crew should stay in a different hotel from the band, and there were just so many changes that came down that made it more like a regular band and less family-like, although everybody still was really tight, and you know, we all still had a really good time. But those kind of parties I just described stopped. It was just much different. If Michael's wife wasn't on tour with us, then most nights that we had off, you know, Michael and I would get together and have dinner. I mean,
right, sure.
And a lot of times we'd go to a bar because Michael would like to go up and jam, you know. Yeah, the vibe changed a lot, but the band was still great and tight. And, I mean, one thing that I don't think people realize, when Sammy came in the band, 5150 went to #1. They'd never had an album come out at #1. But the point is, that would have happened with the next record with Dave.
Right.
That was something that was progressing there.
Yeah.
And if Dave had done the next record, it would have come out at #1.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The band was escalating at the time, getting bigger every year. So, you know, that would have happened. But people always ask me, who's your favorite singer, Sam or Dave? And I said, neither one. I mean, both of them. They're 2 different animals altogether. Mm-hmm. And I love the Sam era. I love the music. I love the Dave era. I love the music. Hey, I love the Gary Cherone era. It's just the music wasn't bad. It's just that the album wasn't up to par, and Gary came in fighting an uphill battle from the get-go, you know, with the fans and the critics, you know?
Yeah, that's for sure. Were you around when Dave and the band were
recording Me, Wise Magic and Can't Get This Stuff No More?
Yes, I was.
What did that sound like?
Well, you know, Dave had been gone for a long time, and they had this idea, and I really liked those 2 songs, but then it kind of fell apart again, and I wasn't there when it kind of fell apart again. It didn't really fall apart in the studio. You know, they went on MTV, and they did that whole thing. This is the first time I've been on stage in 12 years with the band and all that. Then it kind of fell apart again. It never went any further than that. And I'm really not sure, you know, why. Because we weren't actively in the studio after they put out those 2 tunes that they put together for the first best of release, you know?
Right.
How it fell apart, I don't know.
Was there a plan for a second best of? Because the first one was called Volume 1.
I think they just came up with that. I mean, and then when they did the 2004 reunion, Warner Brothers wanted to put on another best of, which they did.
Right. Which they ended up doing the double, the best of both worlds, right? So there was also rumors of a second reunion with Dave around 2000, 2001. Michael talked about the band recording some tracks. Were you around for that?
I don't really remember. I probably wasn't because I was touring a lot. Between Poison and Rat and a few other bands, you know, I was on the road most of the time.
Right, of course.
One thing that worked out for me is Michael and I were always really, really nice to our opening acts. And most of the big 80s bands had opened up for Van Halen at one time or another. That was a very coveted slot, you know, to be able to get the opening shot. I ended up meeting a lot of those bands like that. And since I was always really nice to them, quite a few of them called me up and said, hey, you're not touring with them. Can you come out with us, you know?
Right.
I mean, that's how I ended up touring with Rat. That's how I ended up touring with Great White. That's how I ended up touring with Poison.
How did you find the Ray Daniels era? What did you think that was all about when he came in and managed the band? What was the vibe like with him?
It was a distant vibe.
Okay.
Ray Daniels, I'm sure he had his own way to do things, and he was Alex Van Halen's brother-in-law. That's how he ended up getting that gig. He was never very friendly to the crew. crew. I never really got to know the man. Obviously, it didn't last. So, like I said, it was a distant kind of vibe from the management during that era. I wasn't privy to a lot of it.
Were you around when Mitch Malloy came to try out?
That was the name I couldn't think of. No, I wasn't there, but he's the one